Good morning, comrade. You are listening to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning, Comrade. Jeff on the show today. Robert's not here, but we do have a very special guest. We have one of the hosts of Left Reckoning coming to us from Austin, Texas. We have David Griscom. How you doing, David?
I'm good, man. So stoked to be here.
We don't always let University of Texas fans on the show, but this time we'll make an exception just for you.
I'm glad for it.
So anyway, I want to talk to you. Actually, first, you could talk a little bit about you're the host of a show called Left Reckoning. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been doing this for a little while, but Left Reckoning is a program that covers politics, both national and international, but with a special focus on the South and with Texas mainly. We also do a bit of the Midwest as well. My co-host Matt is from North Dakota. And, we've been in that sort of milieu of like left-wing media, left-wing politics for a while. We used to work on the Michael Brooks Show podcast.
R.I.P. King.
Yeah, and he was obviously a huge influence on both of us and, an incredible person. People should check him out if they haven't listened to any of his work before. But one of the things that we really want to do, I think a moment that really struck me is so I'm from Texas. I also went to high school in South Carolina. Don't need to go through my whole life story, but
where'd you go in South Carolina?
I was in Myrtle Beach.
Oh, no way. That's cool. They don't get a lot of play in national left media. They don't get a lot of play in a lot of organizations like DSA. The South, I'm a Southerner too. I still technically, I guess Virginia is the South, officially. There's a difference in culture from New Orleans and Virginia, obviously, but let's give it to them. But there is sort of a dismissal, I guess, or it feels like a dismissal of the sort of the viability, perhaps, or some other components. I'm not exactly sure how to put my finger on it, of what the South is, what the South is, what the South is capable of, what people in the South are capable of, and also it's almost like it's a failure by refusal to engage in a lot of situations, and it's really unfortunate.
And I mean, I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the South in general in a second, but I to be as kind as possible. I do think there's a big part of it is that a lot of the big media operations are just based in New York City or LA. And the second thing is, nothing wrong with people moving or leaving the South, obviously, but a lot of times people who leave the South and then end up in a New York or in an LA oftentimes don't have a lot of nice things to say.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that also plays into a lot of the kind of thought process about what's possible here.
Yeah, they left because they've given up in a certain sense. And so
exactly.
they can basically have the Southern, bona fides, whatever that is, and say like, "Hey, I'm from the South. I've seen it down there, and it ain't nothing happening down there."
Exactly.
And yeah, I don't take that perspective. I don't engage. I mean, a little background on myself. People in the show have heard it many times, but I mean, I was engaged in my teachers union for many years. I was actually on the Central Labor Council of the Greater New Orleans AFL-CIO. I was a co-chair of the DSA chapter when I left New Orleans. So like, I've definitely been like plugged in there, and I am not saying the same thing. It's tough. I was actually on the Democratic Party state and like the state committee and the local committee just to sort of like see what's going on there.
Yeah.
Let me tell you, folks, it's bad.
Yeah, no, it's true. I mean, we both Texas, same thing, unfortunately.
But so like Texas, in terms of that, there's like Texas almost feels like it definitely is the South, but it also feels like it has a little bit of its own flavor to it. There's like I mean, if you think about the history of Texas, it literally was its own nation for a short period. So I mean, I guess that does at least carry over. But I don't know. You want to talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, my hot take on Texas is like, I think more than anything, it's like, I mean, like, I consider myself a Southerner, and I think that I get that experience mostly because, like, one, I'm from Austin and like where I grew up and the people I grew up around, and then also like spending a lot of time in South Carolina as well. But like in Texas, generally, like my thought process about it, you just have to think about Texas as a place that's been built up by a lot of different groups coming here, right? And some of those have been Mexican American immigrants, obviously people who've been here before Texas was a thing. And then also a lot of, significant migration from the South, both black and white. And then that gets mixed with like Germans and Czechs and people who come in later. So like Texas has, I think Texas is a Southern state. I think it's unique because like it's, all these different groups have sort of come and created something that's unique there. But I mean, frankly, like every state in the South is unique, right? Louisiana is not the same thing as Georgia. So, this honestly, this whole, I mean, I'm happy to like dig into this debate with somebody if they ever really want to get into it. I could talk about it for a couple hours if they want to. But like really what it comes down to with the whole question is Texas the South or not? I think it's because Texans are mighty proud about being from Texas. And I think that pisses everybody else off. So you know what I mean? So they're happy to come at them for that.
Yeah, no, and that's cool. And I guess some people like have a problem with that or whatever. And I'm just sort of like, I don't know, it's fine. It's a thing. It's not good or bad. It's a thing.
But like, I mean, look, I think that like particularly like the Western South, and I'm talking about like Louisiana, Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, right? They also have a very unique history. Just generally, but particularly with like the people who were there, the labor movements that were there, that there's like there's, I mean, we're neighbors, right? So like we people were coming in and out, in between these groups. And I do think that like, sometimes even talking about the South is almost too broad, right? Because Virginia is, as far away to me as like Massachusetts sometimes, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and yeah, it is sort of like it makes it really easy to just like take an entire part of like America and just like write it off and say like that's the South, it's over, you can't do anything there. And like which is also very funny too. If you look at even like fairly recent political history, if you look at Florida, actually this is like extremely recent political history, where they literally just passed a $15 minimum wage by what's the word I'm trying to think of, by ballot measure. And like and that's something that you would think that like, the yokel yucks in Texas who vote for Ron DeSantis, they hate workers or whatever. No, the reason that my sort of idea in terms of like states that are like southern states that are often like ruled by really reactionary forces, they're often take that option because it's the more sort of like entertaining of two very very bad options. You know what I mean? They would rather like get a little bit of catharsis by having someone who will like be horrible to like it's a problem. It's definitely a problem, but they'll be horrible to like marginalized groups in a place, because the other side, the Democrats in the South, who bank on the strategy of being terrible to sort of like maintain things the way that they are, they they don't really do anything to provide an alternative. They just sort of like exist to sort of say, hey, we need to make sure that we keep things like a little bit less horrible here, at least rhetorically, but we'll actually do the same stuff. We have a Democratic governor in Louisiana, and I keep saying this over and over again, he, to his credit, he just vetoed a very awful bill against trans people that just got passed by a very sneaky measure in the legislature. But he's also done awful things in terms of like abortion. He signed one of these 6-week heartbeat laws when people always associate with Republicans, and he's got the exact same position with the Republicans on abortion that they do.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of like gets to it. Like, it'd be one thing if like people were being given a kind of more radical or economic populist or ideally maybe socialist option, and they were choosing reaction over that. But like, for the most part, what you get is, we're just going to be, we're going to sort of tail the right. And, so vote for us if you want a little bit less of the other stuff that these other people are running on. And like, it hasn't worked. I mean, like, I've barely ever lived under a Democratic administration in the state of Texas, right? We haven't had a statewide official in the state of Texas since Ann Richards. And Texas used to be the hotbed of progressive politics in this country. The past 30 years or so have been disastrous for that movement. And like, there's a kind of refusal to sort of reckon with those lessons. I mean, from my friends who try to do this work of maybe seeing about getting involved with the Democratic Party, from what I've heard is the Texas State Democratic Party is extremely hostile to newcomers. They're extremely hostile to a lot of progressive kind of politics. And like, you're starting to see some pockets develop, obviously in cities like Austin, San Antonio, and Houston, but at a certain point, if you just continually get destroyed by people like Greg Abbott and Ted Cruz, there's a real problem. And I think like one thing too, and like I usually have to make this pitch to like a non-Southern audience, but like, one of the points that I usually make to folks, from outside, is that also remember that like the vast majority of working people just aren't voting in the first place. Yeah. Right. And effectively, like the Republican primary in the state of Texas is the election for most people. So like there's not really a lot of opportunities for people to get involved and demand something different. And I think that, people have, most people around me, most working class people around me, I think have a general suspicion of politics.
100%.
Yeah. And I think it's not
they have for good reason. They have every reason to feel that way because politics, like politicians are such scammy liars, man. Like it really is the case.
And like it's tough because like, I mean, I don't think that's like a thing that I want to see permanently. Like I want to see like high voter turnout from working people. I want to see, working class politics win in this state. But it's an uphill battle because, people have had folks come into their community and say, support this, support that, all their entire lives, and things don't get better. And also like, let's also not forget too that, because this always gets like, I think, I mean, like, significant parts of the population in Texas do vote for, a Joe Biden or an Obama or a Democratic mayor or a congressperson or whatever, right? So, the idea too, sometimes people flatten it, right? And they just act like it's like 95% of the state is like Republican. It's like, no, it's a lot, it's significantly closer than that as well, right? And it's just like, people don't believe you when you come and knock on their door and you say, I want to fight for this or I want to fight for that. And like, I think the job of, progressives and democratic socialists and groups like that has to be to start convincing people that actually, like engaging in politics is something that can change your life. And it's a tough, it's a tough thing, it's a tough pickle to get out of because, as people in their lives have experienced, you get promised a lot of good things and they very rarely materialize.
You're right. Let me pause real quick for station ID. You're listening to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. Jeff on the show. We have guest from Left Reckoning, David Griscom. We're talking about Southern politics and also about sort of the sort of disengagement that many working class people tend to have when it comes to politics just generally. Most people don't vote. Most people don't get engaged. And we were just saying that it comes for very good reason. I mean, I would argue it's for good reason because they really are getting nothing to offer, even at the national level. I mean, it really does feel like the, again, the most pro-labor administration in the history of this country, which is actually probably true. I mean, I'm not even joking, but like they just busted a nationwide railroad strike. It's just like one of these sorts of situations where it's like this is like lowering expectations to the point where the best you can get ever is is going to bust this nationwide railroad strike, And yeah, I just wanted to sort of kind of push forward that point to the perspective of like internal strategy of these like power brokers within these parties, which tend to, I think, divide people up geographically. And they'll say that like, oh, any kind of progressive movement or whatever is coming from New Orleans, and that can fly in New Orleans, or that can fly in Baton Rouge or whatever, or even Shreveport or Lafayette or whatever, if people want to be really froggy about it. But like it would never pass in New Iberia or whatever. And that's sort of like a way, or like the North Shore of Louisiana, of New Orleans, which is like KKK country, historically speaking. But like that's sort of weaponized by these power brokers to essentially divide urban and rural working class people. And to sort of like smash up any kind of alternative to the one way that politics can be done, which is tailing Republicans, like you mentioned earlier, by basically being like the Diet Coke of reactionary.
Yeah, I mean, and like, even worse than that, I mean, we're seeing right now that, because they do the same thing. It's like that can work in Austin, or that can work in San Antonio or Houston or whatever. Now the state government in Texas is basically trying to preempt and block municipalities and localities from doing any kind of politics, right? So that's like shut out.
Yeah, literally, what was it? Austin that passed paid sick leave like 4 years ago or something like that, and the state preempted it, right?
Yeah, and they're working really hard right now. I think very likely to potentially go through, basically something that would prevent like a vast majority of like laws or regulations when it comes to work and a whole host of other things coming from from the cities. And like the argument from the Republicans is that like Texas is a state for business. We need to, have clear laws, and we can't have different laws, and which is ludicrous, right? Because it's just like any other system, any other state, operates in that way, that you could pass citywide ordinances and things like that. And also, like, let's be really clear about what we're talking about here, friends. Like, we're talking about water breaks for construction workers. In a state, I mean, it's 105 degrees here today.
Literally, I mean? I still get the notifications from like the text alerts that basically say it's going to be 100. It's going to have the feels like temperature going to be like 115 degrees in New Orleans right now.
And and it's really tough because like I also don't want to be too doom and gloom about it, because like there have been like a lot of really exciting and successful moves here. I mean, one thing that's been really exciting here has been using ballot initiatives in cities, which is why they're so worked up about trying to block those. Yeah. In the 2022 election cycle here, which was a complete wash for Beto and the Democrats in the state of Texas. They pushed, they were able to get marijuana decriminalization in, I think, about 5 cities here, right? Which is massive. There's been fights about, how that's enforced or whatnot. Right. So there's this thing about like you bring questions to people, and more often than not, like you're going to see this more progressive vibe. And, Denton, Texas endorsed Medicare for all, right? Which is, is important. Obviously it's just like an idea, but like it's showing that like there's support for these kind of things. San Antonio has a good mix of like progressives and DSA candidates on the city council. Obviously, Greg Casar from here in Austin was a former DSA member and city council member as well. So like there's a lot of things that are happening. There's been a push from the Texas AFL-CIO to support a just transition. They don't use that phrase exactly, but it effectively is a just transition for oil and gas workers here. So there's a lot of hope, and like, I just, because I always have to walk this fine line, because like I get really bummed out about the state of politics and things like that. Yeah. But I'm also incredibly optimistic about a potential future and a break. But it's going to have to take, some big strategy, some real mobilization, and some commitment. And some more than anything, I think it's like having some farsightedness, where you're not just looking solely at like what each election result is telling you, and sort of saying, what would it take to build a base that can actually function on a statewide and ideally national level here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sort of like to kind of kind of beg that question a little bit. I mean, if it's up to you, or if you were be the person to answer that question, at least in a, what are you thinking about could be a potential, uniting factor for, working people? What are you thinking? Because I have my ideas.
I mean, I think, the classic slate of things like Medicare for all are things that are, that just at a certain point, like we've been arguing and pushing for this for so long that like we forget how mobilizing it can be. It's extremely mobilizing. Hell, I just had to go to the doctor today, and like I had that horrible moment at the end of it. I was like, oh my God, how am I going to be able to pay for this? This system's so confusing, right. So that's just something that's always in people's faces.
I hope I don't have to get surgery, not because I might die or have to do the surgery, because I might not be able to afford the copay.
No, 100%. Right. So that's something that's really mobilizing. I think here, and I think like Louisiana, we share a lot of, similar industries, for example, like oil and gas, and like figuring out how we're going to deal with that and transition to, green energy, renewable energy, I think is something that's really pressing and people can feel it. I mean, you talk to people here who went through Winter Storm Uri, when the power went out for days, and people died. Sometimes people just like a bunch of Texans were cold for a few days. People literally died during that period. And so talking about real ways to deal with the grid, and transition to more renewable energy, ideally, also, different technologies like nuclear and things like that. Like, I think these are things that we can make this argument because, like, look, we pay out of the nose for electricity in Texas, a state that is known for being an energy capital of like the globe, right?
I thought y'all made it like a free market sort of situation. I thought competition was supposed to kick in.
Yeah, the competition has kicked in, and that's meant that the price has gone way up, right? And it's like, and again, like these are these things that just touch so many people. So like, like you could do a real door knocker version of that instead of my rambling is just saying like we're for like cheap green electricity, we're for Medicare for all, we're for higher wages for workers, we're for more protections for workers, we're for unionization, and these are things that are massively popular with people, and they're also things that aren't just like, because like in the southern state voting's harder than it should be, and I'd like to see that change, don't get me wrong, but in the context where it is hard, you got to give somebody some reason to go and stand in a line for 2 hours. And at a certain point, there's certain people who will show up to vote for like ideas and ideals, and there's certain people who will but a larger group of people will show up to do things that are going to materially benefit themselves and their families,
and they're right to do that. Like obviously, like when people are talking, when you see like people on television talk about like, oh, people are voting their interest, and that's like a problem on national television. Like, it's just like, no, you're supposed to do that. You're supposed to make sure that your family is provided for and that you can like live a decent life. It's not about like whatever high-minded BS any of this is. And like you mentioned, the unionization and better wages for workers, and the sort of like $64 question that keeps popping up for this, at least for me, is like, how do you get the unions on board and have them sort of mobilize their membership, right? I mean, that's something that's like, and that is something that would, I mean, essentially, if you're getting, there could be like a virtuous consequence to that, essentially, where you can also, if you're fighting with unions as part of your program to make it easier for unionization, there's something material that the unions can benefit from, which is more members.
I think that's a great point. And also, I mean, I think more than anything is that, we can talk, till the cows come home about all the things that we want, but until the left starts being constituted more of working class people, this is always going to be an issue because, like, the question of like, union leadership, let's call it, and on the state level, on the national level, well, the answer has to be then, you have to inspire the rank and file of these unions, right, to push for more democratic unions and things like that. But we can say that, like me as an outsider, right? But what matters more is if we have a lot of rank and file members who are saying that as well, right? And I think that's like I think some of the most immediate challenges that the left sort of has, like post these Bernie campaigns, is going to be, being more rooted and more based in like actual working class communities than it currently is right now.
Right, and it needs like organizations like DSA need to be more accessible to working class people because unfortunately, like I mean, there's like a DSA convention that's coming up right next in a couple of months, and one of the things, like one of the ways that their leadership is decided and the agenda for the next 2 years is decided at this, and I've been a delegate to the convention. I was lucky enough to be able to do that. It's really difficult in terms of like who has the time or who has the energy or who has the ability to take time off of work to pay, for convention fees and all this other stuff, to travel across the country to get off of work for that, and then spend hours debating all these, particular issues. I mean, to a certain degree, it's necessary that something like that takes place. But how do you make something like that more accessible for working people? Not everybody can get up to Chicago and be participatory in this, and that's sort of like another huge kind of component that like I don't have a solution for, but it's one of those sort of like mechanical problems that happen. And honestly, for like DSA generally, just like how do you have the organization be, if that's your solution to the problem, how do you have that be accessible to working people so that people will go to your meetings or go to your events or go to your whatever to be a part of it? Like, how do you make it worth their while?
Yeah, I mean, hot take. I do think, and I think this can change. I think it is changing. I think a lot of people who got into like left progressive, or let's call them socialist politics, were progressives first and socialists second. And I think that, there's a limit to how much like American progressivism is going to be attractive. Can we like really quickly sort of when you're done with the thing, like, can we just sort of like define these distinctions? Yeah, I mean, like, the thing that sometimes the reason it gets convoluted is because I think in the short term, they're like in the immediate moment, like there's tremendous amounts of similarities, right? All of these two groups share like a frustration at the corporate power in American society. They're frustrated at the abuse that people of color and women and queer folk experience in this society. They're frustrated with the lack of public services, right? So that's like the unity stuff. The fundamental difference is that a socialist will say the problem itself is capitalism, which is a system of private profit that allows certain groups of people, capitalist, your boss, to basically be tyrants and to dictate what you do on the shop floor, at your job, etc. But on a political level, they control the political system, not only in the way that a lot of progressives talk about, that they can donate a lot of money to fund candidates, right, which is, of course is a problem, but also because they have all the money. Right. Yeah. And because they have all the money, that means when the government wants to do something, they either have to get that money from them in the form of taxes, or they have to try to, coach them or push them into doing these things. This is what's going on with the Inflation Reduction Act, right, which is supposed to be like our mobilization to fight climate change. If you look at what the IRA actually is, it's tax credits to hope that people with money do some things that we as a society might want them to do. And a socialist would say that, like, we don't think that, a private group of tyrants and babies basically should be able to make decisions like that, that these things should be run publicly, democratically by us as the people, right? And you can, so like these are like long-term goals, and where you get it like practically is like AOC, I think, is like a bridge, for example. Yeah. Between these, like, because I think that some people will say like, oh, she's a fake democratic socialist, and blah blah blah. And it's like, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that she sort of operates in this kind of in between world, and I think a really a meaty way to talk about this is like with the railroad strike that they voted to break. They tried to get some concessions from Congress. They failed, and then they voted to break the strike. And AOC says, well, I consulted workers on this, right? Which is a very different way of thinking about it, because then workers, instead of being like a class, right, it's an interest group, right? So it's just like we're listening to all these different voices instead of sitting there as a socialist making an analysis about capitalism in American society. Is breaking a railroad strike good for working class power or bad for working class power? You're not asking that question. Instead, it's like, I've consulted all these different groups, and it's just like it's a tactical thing that I think comes more from progressive thinking than like socialist thought. And I mean, there's like AOC is a hotly contested sort of like
personality on the left, which I think is just something that is mostly annoying because like that takes up a lot of oxygen and
It takes up way too much oxygen.
And like it's for me it's fairly simple from the perspective of like, hey, you know what, that stuff is stupid and it is annoying, and like I considering workers to be like an interest group is like kind of insulting, I think, or it's definitely not like
or it's like actually wait, like,
but,
sorry,
like,
sorry, like let me rephrase it. Like, not even so much as like an interest group; it's an identity group, right?
Yeah. No,
so
no,
it's
no,
like,
that's
yeah,
fine.
so like instead of, you know what I'm saying? So like it's like I identify as a worker, right? Which is very different from like actually like, no, do you work for a wage? You're a worker,
Yeah,
right?
it's a class position, but
Yeah.
like also at the same time, like, hey, she speaks the language of politics. That is the way that they're done in that country, and that's a good thing actually to a
I
certain
think so,
extent.
too.
But also like I don't know, man. Like if you see that like she shows up to a Teamsters picket line and hands out sandwiches and talks to workers, like. I lived in a district where Steve Scalise is the elected like congressperson. Like I'll take that AOC over that. Like pretty 100%.
100%. And like that's I mean, you know, people who listen to enough online media know like it's just constant flame wars. People get so worked up about AOC, and like I get called both, right? Like an AOC defender and a hater. And like, no, I mean, like I think that she does incredible work. I mean, particularly in popularizing ideas that I think should be made more accessible for people. She's wonderful at that. In terms of like strategy and building like a working class movement, I also think that criticizing her solely is so wrong-headed, because like if you think there's any problems with like, you know, even what I was just saying a second ago, if you think that there's any problems with like rhetorical style or things like that, well, the problem is actually that like we have like her and like 3 or 4 other people in Congress, right?
Yeah.
And like it will be less of a problem like whatever like particular aspects of like the way that she talks or publicizes things or does things, like those go away when we don't have to sort of put all of our hopes and dreams on a handful of people.
Person, yeah.
And that's why I think, you know, these things get really paranoid and like really like, because like she could be, for example, like the best, and she could get all of these things right. She could have voted against the railroad strike, and that would have been one vote against the railroad strike. You get what I mean? Like, you know, the problem, like sometimes people get really hyper fixated on this thing, and like, yeah, it does show that we don't have the organization that we need. It does show that we don't have the power we need, and we should be focusing on how to change that instead of hyper fixating on one person.
I want to dig into that, but let me pause for station ID really quickly. You're listening to WHIVLP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. David Griscom on the show, one of the hosts of Left Reckoning. And yeah, so again, it speaks to the powerlessness of the left, if a left even exists, in an organized left even exists in this country. And it's pretty hard to argue that a organized left does exist in this country, because it doesn't have the ability to exert any kind of power. And the only thing that an emerging left, which I think probably right now, if you compare this to like 2013, 10 years ago, there is more of a left. It is more of an emerging left, or whatever that means, than there was in, that then. There's more of that now since probably around, let's see. The Sanders campaign really was the biggest sort of like shot in the arm that any kind of emerging sort of socialist movement has gotten in this country in the past 100 years. And the idea that like we can suddenly govern when we're still in the crib, essentially, really is you know what it is? It's almost like you can it's hubris. It really is hubris from the perspective of like you don't really know the score here. You don't know the power dynamics, and you're just whining, essentially. Sorry.
I mean, I think there's a decent amount of truth to that. I mean, I think that if you look at, like, for example, the history of the socialist movement in this country when we were probably at our strongest, probably would have been in the 20s and 30s, 1920s and 1930s, right? Which, for like 100 years out from now. But you look at, where that movement came out of, it didn't just come out of like whole cloth. It didn't just come out because some guy was saying the right thing at the right time at the right place. It came because there were organizations that were representing class interests, right? Like Eugene Debs, right? A famous, presidential candidate, socialist candidate, one who got the most votes out of any kind of socialist candidate ever in America's history, in a general election at least. This guy was a railroad organizer for years. He was a part of the early, the kind of offshoots. Strike. Yeah. And then the offshoots of like the populist movement. And then the populist movement sort of coalesced and like materialized itself and honed itself into like a socialist movement. And it took a long time to be able to build up that capacity. And what they were doing was not just like converting people; they were bringing in organic groups that were already existing. So, unions, tenant organizations, and things like that. Along with immigrants and other groups, but they also have their own social organizations where they're coming in the country. So, like, the thing that I think is really tough that we're sort of dealing with the fallout of, and I still think like the Bernie movement was like one of the best things that's happened to the left in a long time. Yeah. And it was because of the path that we've taken why we have some of these specific issues. But basically Bernie's stuff is like top down, and what I mean by that is, that it's like we're rallying around a presidential candidate, and the second that disappears, then we're like, oh Lord, we don't have. What do we do now? We don't. Not only what do we do now, but we don't even have the grassroots, because like the idea was that like that was going to create the grassroots. We have a lot of people who think of themselves as Bernie supporters or as socialists or as progressives or whatnot, but like those organizations that are sort of like the precursors to having a presidential candidate like a Bernie. We didn't develop those first, right? We sort of did it opposite, and now we're trying to go backwards. And I think we can do it. And I think the lessons and the mobilizations and all these things that came from Bernie. I mean, us talking right now probably would never have happened in a parallel universe, right? Where Bernie doesn't run those two times, right? So like, this isn't me being pessimistic or saying those things were wrong. It's like, okay, this is sort of why we're in this problem right now, and we have to figure out how to take the people who are really committed, who are like already thinking about themselves in this way, or are part of these organizations, and figure out how to sort of build up a lot of these, social organizations and like labor organizations and things like that haven't been developed. And it's hard. I mean, it's a very big like historic project. But I also will say, like,
it is the historic project.
As somebody who spends a lot of time reading the history, particularly of like the Southern labor movement and like Southern politics, when we had a stronger progressive movement, and how like even like Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Arkansas were the hotbeds of the American socialist movement. And looking at that, and all I'm saying is this is like, you're building interracial unions in the South in the 20s and the 30s. 60 years after slavery, right? Those are hard cards to, be dealt, and they did it. Yep. So like we also have to have that kind of confidence that like, as difficult as it might seem, like we can do it too, and take some inspiration from some of those previous movements as well.
And even like that is part of our history that exists in this very day. You mentioned the 20s and the 30s, the streetcar workers that went on strike and these interracial unions. The famous sandwich, the po' boy, in this very city, New Orleans, is literally strike food. It originated that's
beautiful.
As a potato sandwich that had gravy on it or whatever that they gave to people on the strike lines. It's awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, like, it's really amazing to spend some time learning this history.
You cannot get rid of this from our history. You cannot divorce our history from that. I'm sorry.
And I think it's an important thing for the left to uphold those things too, because one of the they were doing this back then too, and they do it now. It's like, not only like, so you were talking a second ago how they're like, well, this might be like a big city thing, like a New Orleans thing, or that might fly here or there. But they also say about like socialists, like, well, that's like a foreign importation, right? That's like European or whatever, and like without even interrogating like that whole mindset, which I think is not great either. It's not true. Like if you're somebody from these areas, it's like, you are. I mean, one story, like I don't think I have the time to go through it, but if people want to listen to it on Left Reckoning, I did a long thing, and I wrote a piece in Jacobin magazine on the fence cutting wars in Texas, which was a really radical, fascinating movement. Where like poor farmers, black and white, got together and they started cutting down the barbed wire fences that were being put up by these big landowners that were preventing people from having free public access to the land.
That's so awesome.
But the way it's always taught or talked about in Texas is like, this is how law and order came to Texas because the Texas Rangers brutally put it down. And this is something that was so widespread across the state. So many people were engaged in it. And the population difference between Texas Rangers and like poor farmers and cowboys and stuff, it's massive. Like, you are far more likely, if you're somebody reading that story today, and you might imagine yourself to be like, oh, I probably would have been one of those things. No, your family were the fence cutters that the Texas Rangers were trying to blow up, when they were cutting down fences. And I think that like being able to claim that history is really important. And also like at the same time, when the right wing is literally waging war on our history, they're literally trying to say we can't learn American history or Southern history anymore. It's a great time, I think, for leftists and socialists to, get a little backbone and say like, no, we're going to claim our radical history because like, America has a really brutal history. And I think this is an important lesson for leftists to keep in their head is like, we have a really brutal history, right? And I think a lot of leftists get that. But I think sometimes we overcorrect and forget that at every bad thing that happened, there were people who risked it all to try to stop it and fight back. And oftentimes they lost, sometimes they won. But like, we owe it to those folks too, who wanted a better South, who wanted a better world, to remember them and remember their struggles instead of just painting with this broad brush. Because, these bad things that happened were done to us, right? They were done to all sorts of people. And, we should remember that people resisted and they fought back too. And we have a proud history of that.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, we have the opportunity to be a part of future history by also participating in the never-ending struggle.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Like that, it's our responsibility to do that, and if we don't, then we're also sort of like we're sort of. I almost see that as almost like a middle finger to the people that have gotten to this in this position that we're in now. The little that we have, you know what I mean?
No, I think totally. I mean, and it's like, and this stuff is also purposefully like hidden. Because it is so dangerous for the ruling classes, for the people who don't want you to know this stuff. They work very hard to try to hide these stories or to try to paint them in different lights. And no, like the South in particular just has this incredibly radical history that I think even a lot of Southerners like aren't aware of. And, that's by design. And like that makes it even more of a responsibility of us to, do that work and look around and investigate a bit. And you'll find a lot more stuff that like will really, I mean, I'm always amazed when I didn't know how deep the Socialist Party was rooted in Texas through my, state education here. I had to find that out as a grown man, way later. But it was amazing to learn. And also finding out that, my part of the state obviously was the hotbed of it made me very proud. But like it's out there.
Go to the places where that stuff happened.
100%. I've done it. It's cool.
And also like, yeah, and that's not even unique to the South, but I mean, obviously like there was a heavy socialist presence in the Midwest. And also like places like Nebraska and Kansas, and like that's where a lot of populism sort of was like most notably like most powerful. I mean, we have our own history. I wouldn't call him a socialist exactly, but Huey Long was a he's a hotly debated figure, obviously, but he basically got his entire start by giving textbooks to black children. And like, now there's obviously a lot more that ended up going into it, but I mean, that's sort of like a part of the sort of populist history of this country. I mean, this state really, and also the country. I mean, he was on a most dangerous people in America list by FDR, which is also very funny. Because of his like heavily redistributionist, so we could definitely agree that was the at least rhetorical tack that he was taking policies.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, and like people like, Long are obviously, controversial for good reason.
Yeah.
But remember that like somebody like that too was like having to grab onto those, popular policies because there were significant socialist and populist movements that were demanding them and were
Hmm.
organizing around them. And he saw something that's like, oh, this can win.
Yeah.
And like this.
Politicians are opportunists, if nothing else.
And like this is the thing with the whole host of the populist movement. Effectively, like it ends up becoming co-opted by the Democratic Party eventually,
Yeah.
because it started out more as like a third party movement, and then some populists basically embedded themselves within the Democratic Party, very controversially because of what Southern Democrats basically were.
Mm.
That meant like turning back on a lot of like the interracial populism, that sort of was a hallmark of a lot of the populist movement. But the people who rejected that, they created the Socialist Party
Exactly.
of the USA, right? And they were very influential in politics, even if they weren't winning. It was just like if somebody is promising this kind of good thing for working people, then the opportunist politicians would grab a policy like that because they knew that it was a winner.
Yeah, they much like we're encouraging working people to vote for something that is in their material interest. We can always rely on political figures to act in their own political interests. So, I mean,
No, I mean, like, and look,
if we make these kinds of things in their political interest for them to support such issues, I don't give a damn what's in your heart. I really don't.
no, and I mean, like, if you look at FDR, and some of my comrades are like way more FDR stands, I would call them. I think that
Sure.
FDR is certainly like one of the rightly most popular presidents in American history because he did a lot for people.
Look at all. It's a low bar. Let's just put it like
Yeah,
that.
but it came at the expense, unfortunately, at sort of derailing a lot of like the more radical politics that were bubbling up. But the point is that like the demands, like you read like the early the founding document of like the American Socialist Party, and like a significant amount of those things end up becoming parts of the New Deal later,
Yeah.
and it was because those people were advocating and fighting for them. So it's like I think also like this is what I was talking about like way earlier. I was talking about like having like being farsighted sometimes too, recognizing that like being engaged in struggle even when we lose. The idea that like it's a zero sum game if you don't win this election, if this movement doesn't win that in this moment, that it was all for nothing, is just ahistorical.
Yeah.
Because these things they bubble up again later.
The struggle is long, and you just have to you just have to keep plowing ahead, like for real. You don't know necessarily what the outcomes of every individual fight is going to be, and many of them you're going to lose. But if you can drum up support along the way and really organize, and when it comes to the modern left, actually build relationships and engage with working people. Hello, we need to do that.
Well, yeah, sorry, you go.
But no, but that's the benefits. You might not see them in your lifetime, but your children's lifetime or whatever that can be there. Go ahead.
No, I mean, I was just going to say, too, like we were talking about when we sort of got into all this, like, people spending time being part of these organizations. And, like, I think that that's a very serious question about capacity, right? Like, you should be able to find ways to, for example, fund people to go, to a conference or something like that. Like, if you want participation, I think it's undoubtable. But also, like, in the question of, like, oh, well, people want to show up to meetings. And put time into this when they're already so busy, which I think is like a very reasonable thing that we should be thinking about. People will if they see that that's something that's going to improve their life. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly.
And like I think the problem is that like while we're sort of like in this crib stage, as you were calling it earlier, it becomes it becomes something that like people who are really committed are going to be the ones who are going to be showing up first, dedicating their time first, and then as we build more capacity. More and more people will be showing up. So like the question, like because this is a constant like lefty thing is like you walk into the room of a bunch of socialists and you're in an organization, you're trying to do something and somebody will come up and be like, where is everybody? Like, why is this group not here? And it's like, I don't think that saying that is like, you should absolutely be aware of that, right? But also be like, well, there's people here right now, and what can we do to sort of get us to that next that next step, to try to fill that lack. And the way that you do that is by like making it so that like being a part of these organizations or being just close to these organizations can open up doors. I mean, this is something, for DSA, for example, right? This is why I think that, finding places where we can win and building up an electoral arm is like really beneficial, because like let's say for the maybe parts of the population that aren't really tuned in, or aren't going to be the first ones to show up at a DSA meeting, if they start seeing that being a part of the New Orleans DSA or the Austin DSA or something like that is a way that like can get like things in, like demands from their community, right? They don't even have to be the big ones that we're talking about, just like fixing roads or something like that, right? If they know that like going to the DSA and saying like, hey, we need to demand this and push for that, and like by making that, that's the group that you go to when you want to get something done, like that is a very short term and I think achievable goal for a lot of socialists to sort of put as like, this is our immediate thing. We want to be thought of as the people who can get things done for working people if you come to us.
Yeah, and also campaigns that can provide political support. So, like, maybe somebody won't become a member of DSA because of whatever this or that reason. That's fine. But if they'll participate in the DSA New Orleans, like, anti-Entergy campaign, which is like another one of the local power companies, if they're like, yeah, I'll sign this petition, I'll show up to the march, I'll do whatever, like, what more can you ask from somebody who's got a life than kids or whatever, and a job, and that is a huge dub if you ask me.
I think so, man. I think so.
So let me pause real quick for station ID. You listen to WHIV LP New Orleans 102.3. This is Good Morning Comrade. And so I guess I wanted to wrap up just sort of talking about another thing that's been sort of hotly contested, especially over the past couple of weeks. I saw you tweeting actually a hilarious message. But if you could just sort of like run down. So if you could run down the sort of Cornel West presidential election. People don't know. I mean, a lot of white people listen to the show. Cornel West is like a legendary figure in the civil rights struggle, and he's a very important person, especially like to black folks, especially people that have gone to historically black colleges and universities. And he's running for president right now. He had originally decided he was going to run for the election for the People's Party, which I don't even want to talk about them. They're a bunch of like weirdo freaks, if you ask me. But like he ended up just today go behind the Green Party. Do you want to talk a little bit about like what a sort of like emerging left, how we should relate to these kind of campaigns, and especially in this political moment where like the Joe Biden like anesthesia is still like putting us all to sleep, and Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis are trying to like make everybody hate trans people or whatever.
I mean, I think it's like it's going to be interesting, and there's a bit of it that's very complicated and a bit of it that's very simple. Just talking about me, personally, like I think one of the easiest political decisions I'll ever make in my life is when I if I could walk into a polling place and put a box next to Cornel West, I'll be very happy. We're not just talking about me. As like the left, it's just like it's definitely difficult. The thing with the Cornel West thing right now is that like I need to see, for example, what this campaign ends up looking like in terms of like how much momentum and mobilization that it can get. Because I think that like the initial launch with the People's Party was a little bit disastrous, and it doesn't look very good. But Cornel West as a figure is, I mean, like incredible, as you were talking about, like extremely
unassailable character.
Incredible. He's an incredible speaker. He's somebody who is a socialist, right? Who talks about not just money in politics, but like the power that the rich have over society. He's somebody who does that can do that in a really great language, and like it can command like the history of the American struggle, American art and music, and and philosophy, right? He's like he's a guy you want to see on stage, right? Just to watch him on stage. So like So that's that. I mean, but zooming out from even Cornel West, like where I'm at right now is like so much of the left movement right now is like hyper fixated on presidential politics, and I get why. It's because like it's the most exciting thing. It's the time where like everyone gets to sort of be asked their opinion on politics, even if it's filtered in the way that it is, like Democrat versus Republican, or even voting third party, right? Like you get to make a statement about your ideas, and like I don't want to attack that too much, but I think this hyperfixation isn't helpful right now, just going back to what we were talking about earlier, because like what we really need to be doing is building a base, and that's the thing that we don't have. So like there's all these questions like, oh, should we not vote for Joe Biden, or should we vote for Cornel West, or should we not vote at all, or do this? And at a certain point it's just noise to me, because there is no us at this point, right? Like if you had an organization that could say, we represent 10% of the electorate, let's call it, and they were making decisions, we're going to vote third party, we're not going to vote, we're going to vote for this person or that person, then it's like an interesting strategic conversation. What we were really talking about right now is disparate individuals going and making an individual decision, and like what we need to do is to change that into like actually being something that's a part of some level of a collective, ideally something that's like represents like the working class. So like I don't know, like I'm back and forth with the West thing, because like it's really easy for me. Like West I think is great. I think he's a really great figure, and he can articulate a lot of these things. I worry if this vehicle is going to, continue to sort of drive us in this like fantasy that basically the left is going to be able to reemerge as a strong national force, like via presidential campaigns. I'm very pessimistic on that.
You can't reverse engineer a movement, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, and I think I do actually genuinely believe this, that like Bernie was probably the best shot, and I said the same exact thing about Marianne Williamson, and I like her less than Cornel West, even though I think that it's a smarter strategy to go within the Democratic Party or whatever. Maybe people disagree with me on that or whatever, but like they can espouse the policies and the positions of a sort of leftist perspective or a working class agenda or whatever, but if you don't have a movement behind you, you got nothing. And the closest that we had to that was Bernie, and I think unfortunately the other two we have much less of.
Yeah, no, I mean, like it just for me, and like this not good for business for me as like a politics talker for a living.
Yeah,
that my answer is so boring.
True.
It's just like that we just need to like what we really need to be focused on is building a movement, and like maybe like. If there's a way that is dual track, for example, with this, like if the West campaign like is able to start building up that kind of movement, I think that's great. It's just so early, it's hard for me to see, because basically like before West announced, I mean, I had been saying that like I think you could reanimate like any great figure from history, bring back Debs himself, right? And I don't think that would do it. And like this is this is sort of what I'm getting at, is like less about West or anything like that. It's just like I don't think that like the silver bullet basically is a certain person, rather than like actually building that kind of movement. So I'm not saying to not be interested in these things, or to not pay attention to them, or not even to be excited by them, but don't like hyper focus, because I'm sorry, like as somebody who's done this for a while and has been through a few presidential cycles, it sucks up all of the air out of the room, and that's the only thing that anybody talks about in political media, or just like the news in general. And I don't think that's good when we have all of these fights that are in front of us. If it could be something that's attached to other stuff, I think that's great, and I think that that's more the reorientation that we need more than anything.
Yeah, and I mean, as I'm maybe a little bit more like I am genuinely in a position of like we kind of like I was actually excited to ignore a presidential election for one time. I'll just be like grilling the entire 4 years, but I mean obviously I'm exaggerating, but obviously I'm exaggerating, but like just having a little bit of time to not focus on all of this stuff that we actually don't have any influence over would be nice for focusing and drilling down on what we need to do where we're at now. So I guess we're saying kind of the same thing. Yeah.
I mean, that's like, again, this is like, that's where I'm at. It's like the number one goal is to be building the movement. And look, if these things can be the shock that's needed, I am here for it. Unfortunately, I'm just too pessimistic at this point. We did it in 16 and in 20, and we got a lot out of it. And I just don't know how much more juice there is in that lemon.
Yeah. So as we wind down, just wanted to, where can we find more information about the show? You mentioned a couple articles in Jacobin as well. Where can we find stuff?
Yeah, so you can find us Left Reckoning on YouTube. We're also on all the podcasts out there. I write for Jacobin every once in a while, so I have a few pieces. I have a piece on Greg Abbott and what he's done to the state of Texas.
Is he good or bad?
You know what the piece is about. It's just as a little plug, it's about how Greg Abbott has used the COVID-19 pandemic to consolidate power by using a really cynical reading of the Texas Constitution to concentrate power.
Oh my God!
So it's a devastating
He's a
reality
figure. He and DeSantis are very similar in the sense that they know how to wield power if they get in that position.
They do.
They're just monsters.
And Abbott especially, I think, doesn't get enough credit from the left for how they know how diabolical he is, but the guy knows how to push the law right up to that gray level, and oftentimes even push beyond it. But that's the Jacobin. I also have written some history on the fence cutters, which we're talking about. I have a piece probably coming out soonish on the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, which has a good Louisiana angle people should check out. And check us. You can listen to Left Reckoning on all the different podcasts and YouTube, and we tried doing Twitch, but I'm not enough of a gamer to do that frequently.
Well, that's until I get you on Street Fighter 6.
There we go.
All right, thanks, brother. Thanks, everybody, for listening. This is Good Morning Comrade. You listen to WHIV LP New Orleans. We love you. Bye-bye. All right.
Sweet. All right.